This video presentation is part 1 of a series of 2 videos. The second video as part 2 evidently can also be downloaded and watched separately. Both videos were produced by Etienne Browns. He has a 5 years university civil engineer degree which corresponds to Master of Science. He has been a scientific researcher in several domains during all of his career. A number of his broad publications can be found at ResearchGate. He reports in this series of 2 video presentations about his private research, based on laser experiments. His dedicated laser experiments started in 2006 and fully confirmed experimentally his specific views, based on photons, regarding light phenomena. He proved thereby theoretically and experimentally the existence of severe anomalies with respect to the views within contemporary science, thereby revealing the existence of multiple flawed contemporary paradigms, based on light. At ResearchGate his corresponding project is indicated as Karl Popper's type of falsification, through theoretical and experimental anomalies, of multiple contemporary paradigms based on light phenomena. In this first part he discusses his views on the existence of a massive theoretical anomaly and the totally flawed character of contemporary paradigms based on light. A paradigm is a theory or model that is believed to be true in a specific time era in the history of science. The history of science is spilling over with scientific paradigms which in the end showed to be flawed and therefore became obsolete. The elimination and replacement of erroneous paradigms is a completely normal evolution within the history of science. Such was clearly demonstrated by Thomas Kuhn in his research and was discussed in his book, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. As Einstein himself also stated, thus conform to Popper's falsification principle, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, a single experiment can prove me wrong. In Popper's view multiple verifications are very weak when compared with the ultimate strength of one single falsification. The consequences of the theoretical results and the laser experimental results of the research project by Etienne Browns are indeed detrimental for multiple contemporary paradigms, based on light phenomena. Those results clearly represent massive, Karl Popper's type of, falsifications of such paradigms. Etienne Browns had broad discussions with multiple, all university degree, colleagues and friends about the theoretical and experimental anomalies which he revealed during his research project. After such discussions, all of them could only agree with his views and confirmed the validity of his claims. None of them could counter the consequences of his research results, nor his claims. Since this information is evidently important in the domain of science and again, the ultimate goal of this presentation is an urgent call to universities or research centers to simply reperform his specific, but really straightforward, laser experiment. That laser experiment was performed multiple times, thereby showing the same main result over and over in a consistent and reproducible way. An independent scientific confirmation of the result of his laser experiment by universities or research centers will support his claim that multiple contemporary science paradigms, based on light, are totally flawed and need to be reconsidered and even abandoned. In general, the contemporary multiple verification experiments which have, so-called, extensively proven such paradigms then indeed need to be reinvestigated in order to determine the cause of their flawed conclusions. Contemporary paradigm believers should definitely not be confident that our contemporary time era would be totally free of flawed paradigms. Contemporary paradigm believers should look into the extreme importance of, even by Einstein supported, Popper's falsification principle. All of this was already published long before by Etienne Browns, as shown in a chronological order in this slide. All information and contents, related to these publications and the website, was registered in front of a notary and was moreover also the subject of a patent text, thus ensuring an author's copyright protection. The indicated publications discuss multiple contemporary science paradigms. The world-famous Michelson-Morley null-result paradigm is shown to be flawed. Also the Eddington light-bending paradigm, as the very first proof of Einstein's relativity theory, is exposed since indeed that proof is considered nowadays to be inconclusive, and thus is not considered any longer as a proof. Also the second proof of Einstein's relativity theory, linked to the Mercury precession anomaly, can be questioned from basic reasons. Indeed, an exact n-body orbit model simply does not exist for our solar planetary system. Moreover, the significant effect of the wobbling of the Sun in space over a distance larger than its own diameter was seemingly not included in the contemporary analysis. In addition, other flawed contemporary paradigms are discussed as well in the indicated publications. It is clear that the urgent pleading by Etienne Browns, towards a university or research center, to reperform his straightforward laser experiment is long overdue. All the information is already there since 2006, while this video presentation is situated in 2019. Also, his book of over 450 pages constitutes a Thomas Kuhn type of history of science report, but then already as an anticipation and thus pre-reporting of the future historical decline of specific flawed contemporary paradigms, based on light. In this Part 1 video presentation, the existence of a number of massive anomalies and inconsistencies regarding the theoretical contemporary science's light modeling approach will be presented. In the Part 2 video presentation in this series of 2 videos on the massive anomalies, the result of a straightforward laser experiment will be discussed and will prove experimentally the flawed character of the contemporary science's approach on light. It is to be stressed that all discussions within the Part 1 and Part 2 video presentations and also all of the indicated publications are fully based on photons, thus not on the light wave model. Interestingly, it can be remarked that Einstein never received a Nobel Award specifically for his relativity theory but only on the basis of his work on the photoelectric effect, whereby he proved the existence of discrete photons. So, it is also extremely strange that Einstein never used the concept of photons in his thought experiments. Before discussing the theoretical anomalies and inconsistencies within contemporary science regarding light phenomena, a very specific contemporary science paradigm needs to be pointed to first. That paradigm can be very well illustrated through 3 specific contemporary science presentations, being available at the Internet. Contemporary science believers consider these 3 classic examples as totally consistent, regarding the views on light by the contemporary science. The 3 examples of the contemporary science's based graphical representations of the trajectory of a laser pulse, thus also a photon, are thus considered as fully correct by contemporary science believers. Let's have a look at the first example. A graphical representation by contemporary science is presented within the YouTube video being called Time Dilation, Albert Einstein, and the Theory of Relativity. In that video, a laser pulse is exchanged between 2 spaceships, thereby making the contemporary science views and principles very clear. 2 spaceships are assumed to travel in perfect sync in parallel at a very high velocity through space. A laser is attached below the upper spaceship and mounted perfectly vertical. A laser pulse is thus sent from the laser in a perfectly vertical downward direction, towards the lower spaceship. The upper ship is called here Ship 1 and the lower ship is called Ship 2. The midpoint of a mirror, being attached to the upper part of Ship 2, is geometrically located perfectly vertical below the laser source at Ship 1. By pausing now this video and by starting the YouTube time dilation video in another browser window, you can first watch the contents of that time dilation video. After watching the time dilation video, you can then resume watching this video. It is advised to do that. In the YouTube video, it is claimed by contemporary science that the laser pulse is always traveling exactly towards the midpoint of the mirror, for whatever value of the horizontal velocity of the spaceships. Contemporary science thus claims that the laser pulse will always hit the mirror at the back of Ship 2 precisely in its midpoint for whatever velocity of the spaceships. This is also very clear from the statement made by the narrator in the time dilation video about how the observer on an asteroid is observing the trajectory in space of the laser pulse. Indeed, contemporary science claims in that respect that the observer on the asteroid will observe the laser pulse to specifically follow a slanted trajectory until hitting precisely the midpoint of the mirror mounted on Ship 2. Contemporary science makes such claim. Nonetheless, the fact that the laser pulse is fired in the direction perfectly vertical downwards from the perfectly vertical mounted laser. In order to put things in a numerical perspective, let's assume a vertical distance of 1 light second between both ships. A distance of 1 light second approximates 300,000 kilometers. A laser pulse thus needs 1 second of traveling time to cross a vertical distance between both ships. It is also arbitrarily assumed that both velocity-synchronized spaceships travel at a velocity of 10% of the speed of light, thus at about 30,000 km per second. It can be remarked that in the time dilation video the authors even mention a spaceship velocity near the speed of light. In this example of a velocity of 30,000 km per second, both spaceships thus will travel a horizontal distance of 30,000 km during 1 second. It is a fact that the laser is geometrically mounted perfectly vertical on Ship 1 to send laser pulses also in the perfect vertical direction. Notwithstanding that fact, contemporary science thus claims that the laser pulse does not travel in such perfectly vertical trajectory in space after its launch at the laser but in the indicated slanted trajectory in order to arrive in perfect synchronization at the midpoint of the mirror mounted on Ship 2. In that respect one should realize that it is also a fact that Ship 2 then has moved a staggering distance of 30,000 km horizontally to the left during the about 1 second traveling time interval of the laser pulse from Ship 1 to Ship 2. Such claim by contemporary science regarding the perfect arrival of the laser pulse at the midpoint of the mirror of Ship 2 should therefore definitely start you to wonder about the validity of that claim by contemporary science. A contemporary science believer evidently will unconditionally support this view of a slanted direction towards the midpoint of the mirror of Ship 2. That unconditional support results from her, or his, contemporary science-based and conditioned type of training regarding the classic ray of light contemporary science's model point of view. A contemporary science believer will thus support the contemporary science's model of a ray of light which is simplistically represented as a straight line interconnecting the laser and the midpoint of the mirror. From that contemporary science-supported simplistic line model a contemporary science believer takes for granted that the slanted trajectory of the laser pulse would indeed be observed by the observer on the asteroid, as introduced by contemporary science in the time dilation video. As a result of that ray of light image, a contemporary science believer then considers, or better, rather expects that it is correct to claim that the laser pulse, thereby also photons, will also travel along the slanted, ray of light, trajectory. This is also shown here in this animation where a laser pulse is traveling along the trajectory represented by the blue slanted line, all according to the views within contemporary science. It should be remarked and stressed here that contemporary science thus does not consider the pulse to travel along the trajectory corresponding to the red vertical line, as indicated in the animation here. Contemporary science believers thus claim that light travels along the slanted line, as a ray of light. That simplistic view however must then obviously also imply the contemporary science principle that a laser pulse, being fired in the perfect vertical direction, must acquire, thus inherit, precisely the horizontal velocity vector component of Ship 1. After the presentation of two further examples of the contemporary science's light modeling approach, it will however be clearly demonstrated that contemporary science is encountering insurmountable anomalies from its own principles. Those anomalies are completely destroying that contemporary science's principle of the, moreover extremely peculiar direction-sensitive, inheritance principle of the horizontal velocity vector component of the laser source. Those anomalies also destroy completely the correctness of the ray of light concept, as used in the world-famous Michelson-Morley experiment. Contemporary science is seemingly not able to counter those severe anomalies and inconsistencies. That simply means that contemporary science then will be forced to abandon such flawed principle and therefore also will be forced to abandon multiple contemporary paradigms being based on light. Let us now move to the second example. A second example of that firm belief by contemporary science and the contemporary science believers can be found in this video on YouTube. That video gives an introduction to Einstein's relativity. Please pause this presentation and then open that video in a separate web browser page and scroll immediately in that video to the time instance of 2 minutes and 15 seconds, regarding the explanation of a light clock. By thus scrolling directly to that time instance and watching it up for about 1 minute it will become very clear that contemporary science claims it to be very true that the photon travels back and forth exactly between the midpoints of both mirrors. Moreover, contemporary science claims such to be the case at any value of the velocity of the light clock device traveling through space, thus for whatever velocity of the spaceship. Contemporary science thus expects to be able to model correctly those phenomena of a laser pulse or photon, to occur in the real world, as a bouncing back and forth exactly between the midpoints of both mirrors. It is shown repeatedly in the history of science that an expectation-based state of mind can be extremely deceiving in the case of the creation of scientific paradigms and modeling of phenomena occurring in real space. The result of such an erroneous expectation state of mind of a scientist is then the creation of a flawed paradigm and the creation of an erroneous model. Such types of flawed paradigms in science can be extremely tenacious in their existence, as Thomas Kuhn showed in his research. In fact, in the case of a flawed paradigm, the paradigm believer is forcing her, or his, view upon reality. Reality, however, does not care at all about the state of mind or the specific belief of a scientist. A totally flawed paradigm will therefore remain totally flawed until being clearly exposed as totally flawed and then being abandoned. Thomas Kuhn and Max Planck also showed that the process of a paradigm shift can be extremely difficult, as a result of the extremely tenacious state of mind of the contemporary paradigm believers and defenders. It seems that it even needs a more tenacious state of mind of the person who is able to present the existence of a massive theoretical anomaly regarding the contemporary science's views and who is moreover able to present the corresponding experimental proof through a straightforward laser experiment. A third example of the firm conviction by contemporary science and contemporary science believers is presented at the indicated website where an animation can be viewed. Zoe drives a car. As indicated in the animation, inside the car there is a mirror A at Zoe's left and a mirror B at Zoe's right. As an observer inside the car and according to contemporary science, Zoe claims that a laser pulse will bounce forth and back exactly between the midpoint of mirror A and the midpoint of mirror B. Moreover, Zoe claims such for any value of the velocity of the car. Contemporary science thus claims that Zoe in the moving car is always observing the laser pulse to travel on the straight line interconnecting the midpoints of the two mirrors. Contemporary science evidently then also claims that Jasper, moreover considered by contemporary science to be at rest, will observe the laser pulse trajectory between the two moving mirrors as a zigzag line. Again, contemporary science thus also claims that the laser pulse inherits the velocity of the moving car, for whatever value of the velocity, in order to bounce back and forth precisely between the midpoints of the two mirrors. The three presented examples thus prove extensively the views and firm beliefs by contemporary science with respect to light phenomena. Let's now move to a first very clear anomaly and extreme inconsistency regarding the discussed views by contemporary science with respect to light phenomena. It is to be stressed that, in this presentation, the discussion and description of light phenomena is fully based on photons. The viewer is therefore asked to think along on the basis of the concept of light as being built from photons. Einstein even proved the existence of photons from the photoelectric effect and received his Nobel Award on that basis. So, on those grounds, it is allowed and perfectly correct to reason on the basis of photons. Moreover, science even made it nowadays possible to produce, in a controlled manner, individual photons. Therefore no one can object the introduction of photons in the following way of reasoning. Consider thus a laser which is mounted, perfectly vertical and upward, on a horizontally movable setup. From a geometrical point of view, the laser is able to launch photons in the perfectly vertical and upward direction. The horizontal velocity of the movable laser setup can be controlled to any velocity value. The classic graphical reference frame representation with abscissa x and ordinate y is used here. An observer OBS1 is considered to be at rest. The reference frame indicated by x OBS1 and y OBS1 is also considered to be at rest. The laser setup does not move in the vertical direction and is positioned at the location x OBS1 equal to 1 at the time instance t equal to 0. Assume now that individual photons or femtosecond short laser pulses are launched at a time interval of 1 second from the laser. In order to be able to demonstrate the upward traveling of the photons, the y-OBS1 axis is scaled here in light seconds. Therefore each y-OBS1 axis scale unit corresponds to the distance traveled by light in 1 second. That approach is very convenient to show what will happen to the location of the photons, according to the views within contemporary science. In the experiment, the laser is assumed to reside at the location xobs1 equal to 1 during the first 3 seconds. Therefore the 3 photons, being produced and labeled 1, 2, and 3, travel as illustrated in the animation. Since the laser source does not move in the horizontal direction during the first 3 seconds, evidently the 3 photons move upwards along the vertical line in the location xobs1 equal to 1. Those 3 photons do not move in the horizontal direction. It is assumed in this experiment that, immediately after t equal to 3 seconds, the laser is set in motion at an immediate horizontal velocity of 1 meter per second, while still launching a photon each second. In addition, the assumption is also made that the laser is able to immediately halt when arriving at the location xobs1 equal to 9. The photon phenomena according to the contemporary science views within the 3 stages of the experiment are now discussed. As shown in the preceding 3 examples, contemporary science claims that the photons, as being launched from the moving laser source, will inherit the horizontal velocity vector component of the laser. According to contemporary science, therefore, the photons with labels 4 to 10 should travel in the manner as illustrated in the animation. From the horizontal point of view, contemporary science thus claims that those photons will reside precisely, while of course traveling in the upward vertical direction, perfectly above the laser during the traveling of the laser from the xobs1 location equal to 1 to the xobs1 location equal to 9. The xobs1 locations of the photons with the labels 4 to 10 are thus claimed by contemporary science to be exactly the same as the laser's xobs1 intermediate locations, while moving horizontally. However, the dramatic consequence of such a view by contemporary science is that the photons with the labels 4 to 10 then will also keep on moving horizontally to the right. Contemporary science evidently cannot claim in any way that those photons with the labels 4 to 10 would stop moving horizontally to the right at the moment that the laser halts at the location xobs1 equal to 9. It is very obvious that there is totally no mechanism why those photons with the labels 4 to 10 would be able to notice or respond to the halting of the laser source at the location xobs1 equal to 9 in order to stop moving horizontally to the right. It would be totally absurd if a contemporary science believer would claim such. In addition, photons are produced by the halted laser at the location xobs1 equal to 9. Those photons have the labels 11 to 15 and they will show a zero horizontal velocity vector component, according to contemporary science. Indeed, the laser has a zero horizontal velocity from the time instance that the laser halted in the position xobs1 equal to 9. Therefore the massive inconsistency within the views of contemporary science now becomes extremely obvious. The photons with labels 4 to 10 will simply keep moving horizontally to the right and therefore get completely disconnected, from a horizontal point of view, from the photons with the labels 1 to 3. In an analogous way, the photons with labels 4 to 10 become also disconnected, still from the horizontal point of view, from the photons with the labels 11 to 15. That is clearly illustrated within the graphical representation in this animation, which is fully based on the views by contemporary science. It is possible to classify the photons of type 1 to 3 as belonging to a group A, the photons of type 4 to 10 to belong to a group B and the photons of type 11 to 15 to belong to a group C. It should then be very obvious to contemporary science and any contemporary science believer that the former reasoning also holds in the case that the laser would continuously produce photons. Thus when having a laser producing a continuous laser beam instead of one photon or short laser pulse per second. Indeed, consider a continuous laser, while at rest during the first 3 seconds. In this animation, the laser starts arbitrarily at the location xobs1 equal to 3 and then will move to the location xobs1 equal to 9, where the laser then will halt again. The laser is continuously producing a large number of photons of the type of group A during the first 3 seconds. The very last photon within group A being produced by the laser in the location xobs1 equal to 3, just before starting to move to the right, will travel in the same way as all the photons of group A, thus along the vertical line defined by the xobs1 equal to 3 starting location. However, the very first photon being produced by the continuous laser, when starting to immediately move horizontally to the right after 3 seconds will, still according to contemporary science, inherit the horizontal velocity vector component of the laser. That photon thus will start to travel as the type of photons of group B. That also means a lasting horizontal movement to the right, as claimed by the views of contemporary science. Therefore any contemporary science believer will immediately understand that the first photon of the type group B will start to move away to the right in the horizontal direction, from the last photon of the type of photons of group A. That lasting horizontal detaching effect between the two groups A and B of photons is a massive anomaly within the views of contemporary science with respect to its linear, thus continuous, thus non-disrupted modeling of light phenomena. Evidently it is also a massive anomaly regarding the contemporary science's extremely simplistic linear ray of light or laser beam model. In this graphical representation, resulting from the views by contemporary science, there is thus clearly a positional disconnection and disruption between the photons of group A and the photons of group B. The photons of group B will keep on moving horizontally to the right according to contemporary science. As a result, the so-called continuous character of the laser beam would be clearly destroyed by that disconnection effect. This graphical representation thus proves that the theory by contemporary science would result into the creation of 3 individual linear light segments, totally getting disconnected from one another. That forms a massive anomaly and inconsistency within the actual view by contemporary science of one coherent total linear ray of light or continuous laser beam. Let's now even show 2 additional graphical representation variants, clearly demonstrating the massive anomaly. In this first additional animation 2 spaceships are traveling in sync and at a constant high velocity through space, as observed by an observer OBS-1 outside the spaceships. A large vertical distance is considered between both spaceships. A laser pulse is fired by the upper ship downwards, towards the lower spaceship. Contemporary science claims that the laser pulse inherits the horizontal velocity vector component of the upper ship. Thus that the pulse is traveling along at that very same horizontal velocity, as should be observed by OBS-1 according to contemporary science. Such claim is conform to the view, in fact mere expectancy, by contemporary science that the laser pulse will arrive precisely at the midpoint of the mirror, at the back of the lower spaceship. Assume however that OBS-1 observes that both spaceships suddenly halt in sync at a specific time instance, somewhat before the laser pulse could arrive at the lower spaceship. The laser pulse would then be observed by OBS-1 to even completely miss the lower spaceship and also even to continue to travel horizontally through space. Since there can only be one truth in reality and since OBS-1 observes the laser pulse to miss the lower spaceship, the observers, inside both spaceships should evidently also observe the same phenomenon of the laser pulse missing the lower ship. The resulting internal conflict, within the contemporary science views themselves, represents evidently a massive contradiction and inconsistency. Let's now extrapolate the preceding reasoning to a continuous laser in that case. A second graphical representation variant is therefore demonstrated in this animation. Again, the 2 spaceships are traveling in sync and at a constant high velocity through space, as again observed by an observer OBS-1 outside the spaceships. A large vertical distance is again considered between both spaceships. The laser in the upper spaceship is now producing laser pulses at a constant rate. All pulses being produced by the traveling ships will inherit, according to contemporary science, the horizontal velocity component of the spaceships. Both spaceships again halt in sync at a specific time instance before the laser pulses are able to arrive at the lower spaceship. The observer OBS-1 now would observe, according to contemporary science, the first collection of laser pulses, showing the horizontal velocity component, to continue their horizontal traveling mode as depicted in the animation. The observer OBS-1 would thus observe, according to contemporary science, the second collection of laser pulses which correspond to the halted mode of the spaceships, not to show a horizontal velocity component. The laser pulses within the second collection then will arrive at the midpoint of the mirror at the back of the lower spaceship, according to contemporary science. Consequently, contemporary science cannot deny, from its very own principles, that OBS1 then indeed would observe both collections of laser pulses to get disconnected from one another. As a result, in the case of a continuous laser, producing a so-called laser beam, OBS1 would also notice such a disruption. Both variants show again in full the enormous inconsistency within the description of light phenomena by contemporary science. As already indicated, contemporary science even runs into a massive inconsistency and contradiction regarding the observation by the observers residing in both spaceships. Another very clear and alternative graphical representation showing the anomaly, as a result of the views within contemporary science, is shown here by Figure A. This figure can be found in the publications by Eugene Browns. A detailed explanation is given in his book. A basic explanation regarding this figure can also be found in the publication as shown here, and which is indicated as publication D2 on the website and at ResearchGate. So you are invited to read the explanation of the meaning of this figure in those publications. In short, Figure A shows the observations of the trajectories of photons, as made by two observers. Observer OBS1 is so-called at rest while observer OBS2 travels along with a laser. That laser is launching the photons in a perfectly vertical upwards direction. Contemporary science then claims that OBS2 must observe the photons to travel perfectly upward along the vertical line defined by the ordinate y-OBS2 axis. But that means that OBS1 then would observe each photon to move in space along its own individual trajectory, being in parallel to one another for the different photons, as shown by the figure. Such is in conflict with the claim in contemporary science that light has longitudinal characteristics, thus the claim that photons or light must move as a ray of light. The inconsistency, regarding the ray of light claim by contemporary science, can also be demonstrated by introducing a rotating laser setup in which the laser is rotating in a plane at a constant angular velocity. Consider a laser, located in the center of the circle. As a reference, assume first that the laser is not moving in the plane of the circle and that the laser is a continuous laser. When switched on, the laser thus will produce a so-called laser beam, according to contemporary science. Let us also assume for convenience in this straightforward example, that the distance A to B is equal to 1 light second. When thus switching on the laser at the time instance t equal to 0 seconds, it is clear that the laser beam will show a progression in time as illustrated here. Indeed, the first photons launched at the time instance t equal to 0 seconds will take the lead, within the collection of photons in that so-called laser beam, and will therefore travel in time as depicted in this animation. Evidently, at the time instance t equal to 1 second the laser beam will have reached a length being equal to AB. Accordingly, at the time instance t equal to 1 second there are evidently also photons which are just leaving the laser and therefore are present in location A. It must indeed be clear now, from the contents of this video and at this stage, that a so-called laser beam consists of a large collection of photons. There are thus photons which are just leaving the laser in location A and photons which are already arriving in location B. The photons arriving in location B are in fact 1 second older than the photons just leaving the laser in location A. Contemporary science claims that it is possible to graphically represent correctly the so-called laser beam as a fully linear segment AB, all according to its view regarding the ray of light model. As a result, contemporary science also supports such graphical representation of a laser beam, in the case that the laser is located in the center and is rotating in the plane of the circle. Contemporary science claims that the laser beam model is perfectly linear, according to the ray of light principle, and that the perfectly linear laser beam therefore must rotate along with the laser, as shown in this graphical representation and animation. Contemporary science, however, runs into a massive inconsistency when supporting such graphical representation of a rotating laser. This inconsistency can be clearly demonstrated by example and by introducing some parameter values for the rotating setup. Assume arbitrarily that the laser rotates at an angular velocity of 36 degrees per second and that the distance AB is equal to 1 light second. Assume further that the laser launches a photon, or a laser pulse, in location A in sync with an angular interval of the laser of 10 degrees. The situation can then be analyzed at the time instance that the laser direction is 10 degrees, thus at the time instance that the second photon or laser pulse P2 is just launched in location A. The first photon or laser pulse P1 was thus launched 278 milliseconds ago in location A, in the perfect x-axis direction towards location B. P1 thus also must have traveled in that time interval a distance of 278 millilight seconds. The main question which arises now is the following. Where is P1 located in the depicted situation? The radial traveling distance, indicated as r, between the location A and the location of P1 is thus, as mentioned, 278 millilight seconds. Contemporary science claims that P1 must have traveled precisely along the rotating line CD and thus must be located on that line CD. However, P1 was launched in the perfect direction of the x-axis, towards location B, but would thus not be traveling on the line AB to the location B since the latter is not accepted by contemporary science. In fact, the claim by contemporary science that P1 is located on the line CD causes a massive inconsistency in its view. Indeed, it must be obvious to anyone that P1 is traveling in the radial direction and that the value of the radial distance r, between the location A and the location of P1, will increase in time. In order for P1 to keep on being located on the rotating line CD, it is clear that P1 then must show an ever-increasing value of its local tangential velocity Vt. There is however no mechanism at all for P1 to gain in time an increasing value of the local tangential velocity Vt of P1, with an increasing value of r. This can be easily demonstrated by a series of calculations in the example. At the time instance of 278 milliseconds, the value of the radial distance r is about 83 million meters. When using the indicated formula to calculate the needed value of the tangential velocity of P1 at that time instance, a tangential velocity value of about 52 million meters per second is obtained. That value already corresponds to about 17% of the speed of light. Moreover, that value of the tangential velocity already increases to about 188 million meters per second, at the time instance of 1 second, when CD shows an angle of 36 degrees in reference to the x-axis. That tangential velocity value of P1 then already should have increased to about 60% of the speed of light, at that time instance of 1 second. Again, there is no mechanism for P1 to acquire such a high tangential velocity value, and finally, as the extremely clear proof in this example of the total inconsistency of the ray of light model in contemporary science. Consider the time instance of 2 seconds when CD progresses to an angle of 72 degrees in reference to the x-axis. The corresponding theoretical value of the tangential velocity of P1 can then be calculated, to increase to a staggering 377 million meters per second, which would be about 126% of the speed of light. That is of course nonsense and a massive falsification of the simplistic view of the ray of light model, as was used by Michelson and Morley in their world-famous experiment. The so-called null result obtained in the Michelson and Morley experiment also triggered Lorentz to suggest the Lorentz contraction principle in the relativity theory. As a conclusion, the only remaining consistent view is that P1 indeed will travel along the line AB, and that each photon being launched by the laser will keep on traveling in its own launch direction in space. Such will be experimentally proven, in part 2 of this series of 2 videos, on the basis of the result of a straightforward laser experiment. Let us now still continue here, for a few additional moments, with a laser which is rotating in a plane. Assume to also accept, as a result from the preceding discussions on the obvious theoretical anomalies in the views by contemporary science, that photons simply must keep traveling in space in the direction in which they were launched by the laser. Let us then also show by example the trajectories of such photons in space, when launched by the rotating laser. Consider thus in this slide a reference frame XY and that is at rest. The laser is located in the center, thus in the location defined by X and Y equal to 0. The laser rotates in the plane of the reference frame XY, at an angular velocity of 36 degrees per second. The laser thus makes a full 360 degrees rotation in 10 seconds. In this first example the laser is discontinuous and is launching a photon at each angle of 10 degrees of rotation. Thereafter, In a second example, a continuous laser will be demonstrated. In this first example, the laser thus produces 36 photons during one full rotation of 360 degrees. The first photon is launched perfectly in the x-axis direction. The x and y range of the reference frame is indicated in light seconds. The range of the x-axis is chosen to be 20 light seconds to the right and 20 light seconds to the left. The range of the y-axis is 20 light seconds upwards and 20 light seconds downwards. The choice of those distance intervals, based on 20 light seconds, enables to clearly show in time the trajectories of all succeedingly launched photons, for two succeeding full 360 degrees rotations of the laser in the xy plane. The simulation model calculations for this example could be easily performed by using Visual Basic for applications in Excel. The calculation results and resulting graphs were then processed in an animation software, in order to obtain the result as shown here. From the animation, the photon traveling mode in space for the rotating laser now becomes very clear. A consistent dynamic image of the trajectories of the individual photons is thus obtained. Each photon stays locked to its own radial launch direction while traveling radially outwards from the laser at the center. That becomes even more clear when focusing and observing those photons which travel along the axes. The extrapolation of this revealing dynamic image towards a rotating laser, which continuously launches photons, could also easily be performed and resulted in this dynamic image. It must be obvious now, to anyone, that the typical graphical representation by contemporary science, on the basis of a ray of light, of a so-called laser beam as a perfect line is totally flawed. Individual photons of a rotating laser will perfectly travel in their individual radial launch direction through space, as depicted in the animation. Graphical representations, when based on Einstein's photon concept, thus demonstrate, in a very consistent way, the displacement of photons, thus light, in space. In that respect, it is very important to have a look at Einstein's world-famous thought experiment on the relativity of simultaneity. It is indeed extremely peculiar that Einstein did not analyze his own thought experiment, on the basis of the photon concept that he introduced and proved, with his publication on the photoelectric effect. Moreover, as already mentioned in this video, he received his Nobel Award for that publication and his photon concept. If Einstein would have based his thought experiment, about the relativity of simultaneity, on his own photon concept, he wouldn't have made the fundamental error in that thought experiment. A detailed discussion can be found in this publication, which can be downloaded from the website or from ResearchGate, as both indicated in this slide. That publication was extracted from the book, as indicated in this slide. The book is available through the website. One thus can find the extensive details in those publications and at the website. A brief explanation will however be given now through some slides and, thereafter, through an animation, as to reveal the fundamental error that Einstein made in his thought experiment. Consider schematically an observer OBS1 who is at rest in location M. A corresponding reference frame, at rest, is linked to OBS1. Consider an observer OBS2 who travels in a train compartment. Both are situated precisely in location M at the time instance t is t1. A corresponding reference frame, thus moving in this case, is linked to OBS2. The location M is precisely in the middle of A and B. A lightning stroke occurs at the time instance t1 in location A. Another lightning stroke also occurs at the time instance t1 in location B. Einstein then asks the following question. Are the two simultaneously occurring strokes of lightning in A and B also being observed simultaneously by both OBS1 and OBS2? Einstein states in that respect, when we say that the two light flashes, occurring in A and B, are simultaneous with respect to OBS1, we mean that the flashes of light, emitted at the places A and B, meet each other at the midpoint M. OBS1 then confirms the simultaneity. Einstein also states, OBS2 however travels towards the flash of light coming from B, but ahead of the flash of light coming from A. And also, OBS2, who takes the train carriage as the reference frame, must therefore come to the conclusion that the light flash in B took place earlier than the light flash in A. Einstein calls this the relativity of simultaneity. According to Einstein, every reference frame has its own particular time. Einstein, however, makes a fundamental error in his thought experiment as a result of his incomplete analysis of the progression in time of the phenomena. That becomes very clear when introducing photons in the analysis, in order to replace the vague character of the strokes of lightning in the thought experiment. A laser is thus introduced in the location A, sending at the time instance t1 a photon Pa in the direction of M. Another similar laser is introduced in the location B, also sending at the time instance t1 a photon Pb in the direction of M. Also, Einstein's train compartment is replaced in the thought example by a spaceship, in which OBS2 is transported at a high velocity through space, along the AB trajectory in space. The velocity v of the spaceship is 50% of the speed of light. The distance A to B is 60 light seconds, and therefore the distance from A to M is equal to 30 light seconds. Evidently, the distance from B to M is also 30 light seconds. The introduction of a spaceship and a large value for the distance AB is of course allowed. Indeed, Einstein's conclusion from his thought experiment should evidently be valid for any value of the distance AB or for any velocity of OBS2. Even for Einstein's train compartment, the analysis and the corresponding calculations can be performed. However, the drawback for small OBS2 velocity values is that a calculation would produce very small numbers regarding the traveling distance and traveling times of OBS2 in the analysis. The small numbers would produce small effects in the calculated results, which would be more difficult to decipher, but nevertheless would lead to the very same conclusions. Evidently, the photons Pa and Pb will travel in space, after their launch in A and B. After their launch at the time instance t1, those photons then in fact become the information carriers regarding the two simultaneous events, which occurred in the past. Indeed, when the photons are traveling in space after the time instance t1, the launching events of the two photons obviously happened in the past in the locations A and B in space. The judgment of OBS1 and OBS2, after the time instance t1 and in a different location in space, about the yes or no simultaneity of the two photon launching events, in the locations A and B in space, thus depends evidently on both photons as information carriers. In order to judge on that simultaneity, OBS1 and OBS2 simply need to apply the straightforward and classic back calculation procedures, well known in physics. The back calculation can be performed on the basis of the time of arrival of the photons as information carriers, and on the basis of the locations of OBS1 and OBS2 in space, at the time instance of observation. In Einstein's thought experiment, it is evidently assumed that OBS1 and OBS2 have the information that the photons were launched in A and B. Einstein also evidently introduced in his thought experiment the fact that M is located precisely in the middle of AB. Since the distance A to M then is the very same as the distance B to M, Einstein reasons that OBS1 will measure the very same time instance of arrival of the information carriers in M. It should be remarked that the time instance of arrival in M is obviously later than the time instance t1 of the launching of the information carriers. According to Einstein, OBS1 measures equal time instances of the arrival of both information carriers in M. Since OBS1 is located in M and since OBS1 knows the exact coordinates of the locations A and B in space, Einstein states that OBS1 is thus able to perform a straightforward back calculation of the time instances of the launching in A and B of the information carriers. According to Einstein, OBS1 can easily conclude, from that back calculation, that both information carriers must have been launched simultaneously in the locations A and B. Is that back calculation procedure also straightforward for OBS2? In which location in space does OBS2 meet both information carriers? And moreover, at what time instances does OBS2 meet both information carriers at those meeting locations in space? An answer on those fundamental questions, regarding an analysis by OBS2, in Einstein's thought experiment, was seemingly overlooked by Einstein. To clearly answer that question, a demonstration by a straightforward example was considered to be an appropriate approach. A simulation calculation was therefore performed for the example and for the indicated a, b and velocity v parameter values. The results are explained and demonstrated in the following slides and, thereafter, in the corresponding animation. Consider thus the spaceship in OBS2 to travel at 50% of the speed of light. A photon is launched in location A towards M at the time instance t1. Another photon is launched in location B towards M, also at the time instance t1. The distance A to B is 60 light seconds. Therefore the distance A to M is evidently equal to 30 light seconds. The distance B to M is also equal to 30 light seconds. Before showing the full animation of the traveling trajectories of the photons and the spaceship, the next few slides will show the status at some specific time instances. In that way the build and meaning of the chart and animation becomes more clear. This slide shows the status at the time instance t equal to 10 seconds. Photon A traveled from location A towards location M the distance of 10 light seconds. Photon A is then located in x equal to 10. Photon B also traveled from location B towards location M the distance of 10 light seconds. Photon B is then located in x equal to 50. The spaceship traveled a distance of 5 light seconds and is therefore located in x equal to 35. The time can be read from the vertical axis while the location can be read from the horizontal axis. Time instance and locations are shown in the corresponding text boxes. The blue line shows the location versus time correspondence for photon A. The red-orange line shows the location versus time correspondence for photon B. The green line shows the location versus time correspondence for the spaceship. In this slide the time instance T2 is shown when the spaceship meets photon B. That meeting location is in location x equal to 40 light seconds and at the time instance T2 equal to 20 seconds. Evidently photon B has traveled during those 20 seconds a distance of 20 light seconds from location B to the left. The spaceship has traveled during those 20 seconds a distance of 10 light seconds from the location M to the right. Remark that photon A has traveled a distance of 20 light seconds from location A to the right and thus has not yet arrived in location M. This information already reveals the vagueness of Einstein's thought experiment, in which he overlooked to consider his thought experiment as a classic meeting problem, and to analyze things on the basis of meeting time instances and meeting locations in space. So, it must already be clear to anyone now that OBS2 is not meeting photon B in location M but in a location to the right of location M. In this slide the time instance T3 is shown when photon A meets photon B in location M. The spaceship and OBS2 clearly have traveled further to the right and is in location x equal to 45 at the time instance T3. That also means that photon A has still an important catching up to perform in order to meet the spaceship and OBS2. In this slide the time instance T4 is shown when the spaceship is caught up by photon A. From the chosen parameter values in this example it should be clear to anyone now that the meeting location of the spaceship and photon A is even in location B. The animation of the trajectories of both photons and the spaceship in time will now be shown. That animation clearly shows the progression in time of the meeting locations and their time instances. The back calculation procedure that OBS2 can use is fully explained in the book by Eugene Browns, his specific publication on this simultaneity issue and on the website. So, OBS2 can easily back calculate that photon A and photon B must have been launched simultaneously at the very same time instance. It thus can be concluded that there is no simultaneity issue at all, as claimed by Einstein. His claim is flawed and incorrect. His existing simultaneity thought experiment, as a contemporary paradigm, is thus flawed. As a reaction, there could be a self-fulfilling circular reasoning by paradigm believers and defenders, on the basis of relativity itself, to, so-called, disprove this all. Those paradigm believers then, for example, start to argue in this all, about the measurement of the velocity of the spaceship. But that so-called velocity measurement problem, was also already countered many years ago and published by Egan Browns. In that respect, reference can be made to his publications in which his concept of a real velocity measuring device is explained. Such real velocity measuring device enables to measure real velocity in space on the basis of photons, as used specifically in the device. The concept of a real velocity measuring device will also become clear in the part 2 of this series of 2 videos on theoretical and experimental anomalies in contemporary science. To conclude this first part of a series of 2 videos on the obviously, Karl Popper's type of, multiple and massive falsifying anomalies, within the views by contemporary science about light phenomena, a reference is made to the Signpost publication, shown in this slide. As indicated before, there are indeed multiple publications by Egan Browns, revealing the existence, in contemporary science, of numerous flawed contemporary paradigms, based on light. Those multiple publications are pointed to and briefly reviewed in this Signpost publication. Those short reviews therefore can be considered as signposts towards the contents of his multiple publications on the important topic of the existence of massive anomalies and flawed paradigms in contemporary science. In the second part of the series of 2 videos, the discussed theoretical anomalies are experimentally demonstrated, through the results of a straightforward laser experiment. In addition, in that second part video, the fundamental cause of the flaws within multiple contemporary paradigms, based on light, will be revealed. Indeed, the human mind seemingly has created a fiction, including the Lorentz contraction, within contemporary science, as a result of a massive error and misinterpretation during the use of mathematical modeling of light phenomena, occurring in real space. The mathematical modeling in contemporary science, through the simplistic ray of light approach, is totally flawed. That mathematical modeling of light phenomena in real space should be based on photons. It will be explained in the second part video that such will need a totally new mathematical approach. As a result of his university degree as a Master of Science, Egan Browns has used frequently, during his activities as a researcher in different research domains, the mathematical modeling approach. As an indication, some references to some of his publications can be found in this slide. For example, to simulate specific processes, during specific research projects, such as heat conduction, material fracture characteristics and electrodialysis, he could apply successfully the mathematical modeling approach. Those mathematical models included also the use of differential equations, the according finite element techniques and software. As finite element software he used in such research activities, for example Sistis and COMSOL. He also even introduced fuzzy set logic, as a successful process control in a specific research project. He prefers to call the method FSL, thus fuzzy set logic and not fuzzy logic. He considers the description fuzzy logic as irrelevant since there is no such thing as logic that would be fuzzy. In fact, FSL involves mathematically well-defined, so-called fuzzy sets, which are then used in a very logical manner in a mathematically well-defined processing procedure. This all illustrates his knowledge about the power of mathematical modeling approaches, but also his awareness about the pitfalls within mathematical modeling. He considers mathematics as extremely useful and a marvelous invention of the human brain. But he is also convinced that the mathematical approaches should not be placed on an over-confidential pedestal of a, so-called, exact science. There is simply no exact science or exact mathematics, as was proven by Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems. It was also already indicated in this video that, for example, there is simply no exact solution for the n-body problem and thus also not for the celestial configuration of the planets in our solar system. As indicated, Egan Browns even performed his own mathematical model calculations of the Sun's planetary system, leading to his conclusion that contemporary science seemingly overlooked in its own modeling the very important wobbling of the Sun in space. As a result, he therefore even challenges the validity of the relativity explanation of the extremely small Mercury perihelion precession anomaly. In addition, he stresses in this respect that the extremely small Mercury precession anomaly is merely based on a difference between a theoretical mathematical model value and a measured value. But again, there is simply no exact mathematical solution for the planet orbits in our planetary system. Moreover, and in addition, it seems that the effect of the wobbling in space of the Sun was even not yet taken into account for a small planet such as Mercury. Mercury is located nearest to the Sun and shows only 10% of the mass of planet Earth. So, the question evidently can be raised what the precision and error range of the theoretical model value of Mercury's perihelion precession then in fact is. When answered, that theoretical model error range then needs to be compared with the error range of the measured perihelion precession value. At this moment contemporary science claims to be able to explain, moreover through a second theoretical model, the extremely small difference between a very small theoretical value, of a moreover seemingly unknown precision and error range, and a measured value, also showing its own inaccuracy and error range. The effect of the wobbling of the Sun and the error ranges thus should also be reconsidered as soon as possible, regarding Mercury's so-called anomaly of the perihelion precession. It is to be expected, as described extensively in the last chapter of the book by Etienne Browns, that the, also by Max Planck described type of, extremely tenacious contemporary science believers and defenders will continue to prefer to stay locked inside their paradigm boxes. They will try, either by circular reasoning inside their paradigm boxes, or either by silencing things to death, to avoid any questioning of their paradigms. But then, at the moment that one university or research center will independently reperform the straightforward laser experiment, as discussed and demonstrated in the second part of this series of 2 videos, and confirm the laser experiment results obtained by Etienne Browns, the real meaning of the title of his book will unfold and reveal the massive flaws within specific paradigms, based on light, in contemporary science. So, there is the real challenge of that straightforward laser experiment, and have certainly a look at the second part video of this series of 2 videos on massive anomalies within contemporary science, demonstrating the massive experimental anomaly obtained through a straightforward laser experiment.